Will Cuba continue to stand defiant in the face of U.S. pressure? The Cuban president has warned he will not succumb to criminal threats from Washington, but still punished under the U.S. trade embargo and with Venezuelan oil shipments now stopped. How much choice will Miguel Díaz-Canel have? Or will others step in to fill the void? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Cuba. Well, Cuba's national motto is Patria o Muerte, which means homeland or death. Now, how many Cubans live by that creed today is unclear, but it seems, at least for those backing the government, nothing will persuade them to break from their patria's one-party system. The Socialist Party has spent 66 years under a U.S. trade embargo. It survived the loss of its Soviet benefactor in the 1990s, and now Havana has lost the support and oil supplies of Venezuela. But can the socialist state survive the Donroe Doctrine? And could China or Russia come to the rescue? Here's a look.
Cuba is dancing to an uneasy tune as the reverberations over the United States' arrest and extraction of Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro echo around the region. In an increasing war of words being traded on social media, the US President Donald Trump said that there will be no more oil and money for Cuba provided by Venezuela, urging the president of Cuba, Miguel Díaz-Canel, to make a deal. Just what that deal is, or could be, isn't clear. Cuba's president says the US has not reached out for meetings or dialogue with him, and in response, he said that nobody dictates what Cuba does, adding that while Cuba has been attacked by the US for 66 years, it does not threaten, it prepares, ready to defend. He hit out strongly against American actions in Venezuela.
Cuba condemns and denounces these actions as an act of state terrorism, a criminal assault against our America, a zone of peace, a violation of the sovereignty of a nation that is a symbol of independence, dignity, and solidarity, and an unacceptable attack on international law.
But for all the strong talk from Díaz-Canel, Cuba is in a precarious position. The US keeps seizing Venezuela-linked oil tankers. Venezuelan oil shipments were the lifeblood of Cuba's thermoelectric power plants. With less oil, the island nation runs headfirst into worsening fuel shortages and power cuts. The US president had previously said he wouldn't need to do anything. Cuba was on the brink, without intervention.
They got all of their income from Venezuela, from the Venezuelan oil. They're not getting any of it. And Cuba literally is ready to fall. And you have a lot of great Cuban Americans that are going to be very happy about it.
In the capital, Havana, opinions are mixed.
I wouldn't want anything bad to happen to us Cubans, like deaths or anything like that. But something needs to happen. The people deserve change.
It's a different story here. The Cuban people talk and talk, but to be honest, 11, 8 or 9 million will take to the streets to defend what little we have left.
Cuba has seen an exodus of a quarter of its population in just the last 4 years, and further economic pain will likely increase those departures. The US and Cuba have long danced to entirely different political tunes. But even if it isn't shouted outright, the drumbeats of regime change are echoing out from the US administration.
Well, joining me now to discuss where Cuba could be headed are from Havana, professor of Latin American political economy at the University of Glasgow and author of We Are Cuba, Helen Yaffe. From Miami, director of the Cuban Research Institute at the University of Florida and author of Picturing Cuba, Jorge Duani. And from Washington, director of the Future of DHS project at the Atlantic Council, Thomas Warwick. Thanks all so much for being with me. Helen, I need to start with you because you are the only one in Cuba right now. Just tell us how it has felt there since Trump really said Cuba is next after Maduro?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of tension, but we have to remember that Cubans, are born with the threat of, with the aspects of US hostility hanging over them, and they've been, born and ready for the prospect of a US military aggression. So this is an incredibly resilient people. We could say that Cuba wrote the rule book on resilience. And so while there is tension, there is also, I can't claim to have spoken to everyone, but the people I'm speaking to are saying, well, if they attempt to come into Cuba, it will be a different kettle of fish. We're ready. We know what to do. We're prepared for this, and we will not submit our sovereignty. Absolutely no way. So, even people who aren't big supporters of the government or of socialism, are making it clear at the moment, the people I'm speaking to, that they would, certainly fight to defend the sovereignty of Cuba if the United States attempted to, in any way, recolonize it.
Right. It's interesting. I mean, Jorge, Helen is in Cuba, but you are in Miami, the home of the biggest Cuban diaspora. Many of them do not support the government in Havana. So what do you envision here? Is there room now for the government in Havana to maneuver again because of the support they feel they have there and keep the economy ticking over as it did back in 1990?
Well, I think that's the main issue, the economic crisis, which many experts have called a poly crisis because it has so many different aspects of it. Certainly the scarcity of food and medicine and fuel now, especially in the threat of the cutting down of the Venezuelan oil subsidies. So it's a difficult situation from both sides. Here in Miami, of course, as you can imagine, there has been a lot of excitement about the recent events in Venezuela because it's considered to be by many one of the first steps towards the toward change in Cuba, regime change. However, I think it's still too premature to anticipate that. I think it's clear that the Cuban economy is on the brink of collapse, particularly in terms of its power system, electricity, and so on, and transportation. But whether that will translate into an uprising against the Cuban government, it's still very difficult to predict.
Okay. Thomas Warwick, first of all, is the Trump administration, from what you understand, actually talking to Cuba? They've intimated they are, but the Cuban president says they're not, and is actually incredibly defiant.
Well, there have been contacts between Washington and Havana for years over both parties. They're always very discreet. They're often done in intelligence channels or security channels. And indeed, when I was in the government, we were having security-related conversations with Cuba. That's not a secret. So I have no doubt these conversations are taking place. But the environment today is so different after what President Trump ordered done to exfiltrate Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. We will see, I don't think Cuba is next. Iran probably has that concern right now. And many of us, of course, would like to see the Trump administration make the whole Gaza peace plan work. There's supposed to be an announcement later this week. So nothing's going to happen for a couple of weeks, but you're starting to see a very serious pressure campaign mounting on the Cuban government to make some fundamental policy changes.
But you alluded to something interesting there, Thomas, and that the U.S., to use the simplest phrasing, seems a bit distracted right now by a number of geopolitical issues on the table. You mentioned Iran. He's also going on about Greenland. And Cuba, correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't offer the same kind of economic incentive that these other geopolitical flashpoints might. So is this giving the Cuban government the advantage here?
No, the political incentive of dealing with the Cuban regime and getting it to make fundamental changes is enormous. There is both a very strong Cuban-American population in the United States, especially in Florida, and there are a great many conservatives who would like to see the communist government of Cuba replaced with one that was open to free enterprise and reflected a better life for the Cuban people. The fact that almost 10% of Cuba's population has left just in the last 2 or 3 years is one of the most striking indications something is fundamentally changing in the population in Cuba. And so we are seeing some fundamental changes. We're just not sure how this is going to play out on the streets of Havana and other Cuban cities.
Okay, let me ask Helen because, well, I mean, the threats are serious, the circumstances are serious. Still, the president of Cuba is particularly defiant, as per normal, we should say. But what do you think this time actually gives him the confidence to stand so strong, Helen? I mean, people are also analyzing whether China or Russia could actually step in and help prop up Cuba, especially in Russia's case, as it had before. Do you see that in the cards?
Well, let me just start by saying, although President Trump has said he's not that bothered about international law, I mean, the right of nations to self-determination is part of international law. And here we're talking about Trump, picking and choosing between which country he wants to intervene and decide, how it should be governed, which economic system, which rulers. I mean, it's all completely illegal and untenable. The fact is, when we talk about Miguel Diaz-Canel being assertive, he is, or defiant is the word you're using, he is asserting Cuba's sovereignty. And either we accept that right to self-determination or we are back in overtly imperialistic days where, might is right. And that's essentially what's happening. In relation to your question about Russia and China, I mean, I think we need to see what would happen. But I think here, in the case of Cuba, there is a very deep ideological and political driver to this aggression against Cuba. And, a really key character is, of course, Marco Rubio, who ran with the rumor that he was, his family were victims of the Fidel dictatorship until the Washington Post and other outlets exposed that was a lie. His parents had left the country before the revolution of 1959, actually under the Batista dictatorship. But this is a man who has built his career on a hard line on Cuba. And let's be clear, none of these politicians care at all about the suffering of the Cuban people. So today, to talk about the number of people who've left the country because the economic situation is so dire. Why is the economic situation so dire? It's because Cuba has been subject to the longest and most comprehensive set of unilateral sanctions in modern history. And it is hurting Cuba, which is the intention. We just need to go and look at the 6th of April 1960 memorandum by Lester Mallory, when he was basically setting out the principles for US policy towards Cuba. And that was recognizing that the new government at that time of Fidel Castro had support from the population, and that regime change would be very difficult. And therefore, what they should do is carry out economic warfare. And the words that he used, direct citation, was to cause hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. And they are still battling away with this tactic decades later. And so those 2 million Cubans who have left, many of them have gone to the United States, that's true. But they are not part of that hostile political opposition in Miami. They have gone to the United States to get a better job, to earn more money, and they want to send that money back to their families in Cuba. They do not want to see their families bombed in the middle of the night, or an invasion or any other aggression from the United States. So that scenario will be very different for the case of Venezuela. And I think that's something that, obviously they're weighing up in their decisions on how to proceed.
Yeah, let me ask Jorge what you make of that analysis. And also, I mean, is really, at this point, is the collapse of the government in Havana what the U.S. really wants? Is it in the U.S. best interest?
Well, I agree that the trade embargo that has been in place for more than 6 decades has harmed the Cuban government as well as the Cuban people, and that it is one of the factors that has led to the largest exodus in Cuban history in the past 5 years. However, there are several other factors that have contributed to this growing migration, including the coronavirus pandemic, some decisions that the Cuban government has made, for example, the unification of its monetary system in 2021, uh, and uh, and other aspects that have little to do with the United States directly. Again, I agree it is one of the main issues, but it has to be part of a larger analysis in which multiple factors are included. And so the issue, of course, of what the Cuban American community feels in the United States about Cuba is complex as well. There have been several Cuba polls that have been conducted by my university, Florida International University, that shows a diversity of opinion, including the issue of the embargo, including when the question was asked, a possible invasion of Cuba, sending remittances, etc. And what we find is that the first generation, especially those who arrived in the US in the early 1960s, are more hostile to Cuba and unwilling to concede anything to the current Cuban government. Whereas the second generation, those who were born here or in other countries, as well as those who have arrived in the last few waves, including the current wave, are more open to negotiation. So it's a very complex situation. And at this point, I think these different points of view are being presented and debated both here in Miami as well as in other places like Washington.
Okay, Thomas, I mean, you talked a bit about the, political interest that's in this for the United States, but expand, if you can, on the real economic interest that the administration might have to sell to the American people to really move on this, and what the administration would face geopolitically against some other prospects, including Russia and China, coming to Cuba's potential defense.
Well, President Trump has spoken with Cuba about the possibility of what Cuba's economy could do, mainly for the benefit of the Cuban people if sanctions are lifted, which he sees as possible only if there is a complete change of the governmental system. Look, the reality is that China cannot do very much to help Cuba right now. Both China and Cuba are huge net importers of oil. China has its own economic challenges and is trying to recover after some slow economic years. Russia at least has oil to offer, and the classic deal from 40 years ago, low price sugar in return for low priced oil is possible. But the fact that Russia has a war with Ukraine makes Cuba a luxury that Vladimir Putin may think he can't really afford to invest too heavily in. But this is not about economics. This is about politics. It's partly about U.S. politics, partly about hemispheric politics. So while Trump was motivated to replace Maduro in order to get access to Venezuela's oil, he doesn't see any actual strong economic advantage to the United States of doing anything about Cuba. Whatever he's doing is motivated by politics, not economics.
In spite of having said no more foreign interventions, no more foreign, anyway. But let me ask Helen, again, one of Trump's cards right now is to try and starve the Cuban regime of its oil supplies from Venezuela and support from Venezuela. But can the government maneuver around that? I know you had spoken earlier about alternatives it has in energy that could be helped possibly by China, whereby Cuba can keep going without this oil supply. To what extent is that really true?
Yeah, so the Cuban government for several years has been trying to carry out a complete shift in its energy matrix towards renewable energies. And a big part of that is this plan that's sort of halfway through of unrolling 92 new massive solar panel parks, which are the technology, the solar panels that's bought from China. And those are in the process of installation. So To some degree, they have alleviated the shortages of oil in terms of generating electricity, but the problem they have is the technology and the capital really to store the energy. So this might be a solution on very sunny days, which is most days in Cuba, but then they don't have that storage capacity to make that last over, when it's gloomy or over the evenings and night times. But that is a process that they committed to. They have a target for increasing significantly. But as everything, I mean, I've written about and I study Cuban development, and every single sector of Cuban development is held up and obstructed by the US sanctions, which make it impossible to get anything in and also sell Cuban goods outside.
And at this point, Jorge, interestingly, I mean, Mexico is being allowed to continue to bring oil to Cuba. First of all, do you think that will last? Will it suffice? And then also, is there a way that these two administrations could go ahead with some kind of talks whereby the socialist principles are maintained in Cuba, so that you don't have to kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater? I mean, the socialist regime has served a number of Cubans relatively well in education and healthcare, many would argue, but again, choking a number of human rights. So is there a way for talks to go forward so that there can be reform instead of another revolution?
Well, you're mentioning Mexico, I think is relevant because just in the past couple of days, the president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, has offered to provide an avenue for dialogue between Havana and Washington. There have been no responses, as far as I know, from either side, but Mexico could be an interesting middle point because precisely it's always had diplomatic relations with Cuba. It has always maintained an active trade with Cuba, and it now has become one of the top 3 or 4 suppliers of oil, with the absence of Venezuela. And also I should add that there have been reports that the United States will not block Mexican exports of oil to Venezuela. So that could provide a minor relief to the many needs of the Cuban economy for oil. However, it doesn't look like Mexico could replace Venezuela, just like China will probably won't, or Russia, or other allies such as Algeria or Iran, for example. So that places the Cuban economy again in very dire straits, even worse than it is right now. And I was thinking just in the last couple of days of the old strategy of option zero, which was something that the Cuban government had coined in the early 1990s with the prior economic crisis after the fall of the Soviet Union, which meant basically that it's prepared to run the island, even in the absence of oil and energy and even manufacturing. So if that is the case, if Cubans are preparing for that, then again, we would expect to have a very difficult situation for most Cubans, which already is very difficult, but it would probably be worse than it is today. Now, on the question of whether the Cuban government is willing to sacrifice some of its basic principles, it's difficult to imagine that simply because, again, it's been decades of holding on to certain principles like the one-party state or the major control of the economy, as well as some of the social welfare programs. So I don't know whether there are any, easy points of negotiations, other than, for example, the release of political prisoners, which has already begun to happen in Venezuela and may also happen in Cuba in order to appease the U.S. government.
Okay, let me ask Thomas very quickly. We only have about a minute left, but I mean, is it possible for a kind of Vietnam scenario to unfold here with Cuba, the way the U.S. reconciled its relationship with Vietnam after the war, whereby Vietnam could keep its socialist or communist government intact, but move forward with full relations with the United States?
That might seem possible, but in reality, I don't think it's going to happen. The one point we all haven't made here is that Cuba policy is run by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's gotten Trump on board with his Venezuela policy, and at the appropriate time, I have no doubt will bring President Trump around to his way of thinking. As long as Rubio is the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, we're headed down a path of confrontation and change rather than cooperation and change.
Well, that sounds quite unfortunate, but that will unfortunately actually have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. So I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. I'm sure we'll be speaking about this again in the very near future. But for now, that's all the time we have. So thank our viewers for watching as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media. And do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.